In this video, we're going to discuss immune system diseases and dysfunctions. So the first thing to cover is immunodeficiencies, and an immunodeficiency is either something you're born with, congenital, or something that you acquire, something that impairs the function or the production of either immune cells or of molecules. And so we'll start out with a genetic condition called severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome, or SCID. This is a genetic defect in which there is a real deficit in B and T cells. And so what happens in this disease is that you have an enzyme called adenosine deaminase, and the defect in it allows the accumulation of metabolites that are lethal to T cells, and this is fatal if untreated. So unfortunately, what usually has to happen is some sort of bone marrow transplant in which you have a different population of T cells produced. Hodgkin's disease is an acquired immunodeficiency. So this is not something that somebody's born with. It is acquired. And so this causes cancer of B cells, and this depresses lymph node cells, and this is what's going to lead to an immunodeficiency. And so these cancer cells can develop in the thymus, the lymph nodes, the bone marrow, or the spleen. So not only the places where naive and mature immunocompetent T and B cells reside, but also where they're actually formed. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, is probably the most commonly known immunodeficiency. And this is acquired, as the name indicates. It's caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. So this attacks the immune system specifically by interfering with the activity of helper T cells. Some of the characteristics that you see with this are severe weight loss, night sweats, swollen lymph nodes, but usually the biggest problem that you have with this is what's called opportunistic infections. And these are going to be organisms that can't normally conquer a healthy immune system, but can actually hit people with AIDS because their immune system is depressed. And so if you'll recall from the last video, helper T cells are the ones that direct the actions of both cytotoxic T cells and of B cells. So you get a huge underproduction of antibodies and a huge underproduction of cytotoxic T cells. So this is the reason why AIDS patients really focus on T cell counts, because it's an indicator of the health of their relative health of their immune system. So some of the opportunistic infections that occur include pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi's sarcoma. HIV gets transmitted via body fluids. So this could be blood, semen, and vaginal secretions, and it can enter the body via a number of routes: blood transfusions, blood contaminated needles, sexual intercourse, oral sex, and mother to fetus transmission. And again, HIV destroys helper T cells and depresses cellular immunity. And again, we're talking about both T cells and B cells. HIV will multiply in lymph nodes throughout an asymptomatic period, which is about 10 years if untreated. And your symptoms usually begin when the immune system has a collapse. So the virus can also lead to the brain, invade the brain, leading to dementia. There hasn't been a cure for AIDS found, but there are 4 major classes of antivirals that have been developed in response to this disease. They can help in combination, but they can begin to fail if the virus becomes resistant to them. An autoimmune disease is kind of the opposite number of an immunodeficiency. So this is when the immune system is too active. And this happens when the immune system loses the ability to distinguish self from foreign. And so in autoimmunity, you have the production of autoantibodies, and these are antibodies against specific types of cells or tissues in the body, and sensitized cytotoxic T cells that target and destroy body tissues. So examples of this include rheumatoid arthritis, myasthenia gravis, which hits neuromuscular junctions, multiple sclerosis, which destroys white matter myelin, and this results in every myelinated nerve in the body being unable to transmit, eventually, every nerve in the body that's myelinated being unable to transmit nerve impulses. Graves' disease, type 1 diabetes, which destroys pancreatic cells. So the victims here don't have the ability to produce insulin. Lupus, which affects multiple organs, and glomerulonephritis, which damages the kidney. So how do you treat autoimmune diseases? You can suppress the entire immune system. So if you dampen down the activity of the entire immune system, then you also dampen down the attacks on self-tissues. And so there's a picture here of hydrocortisone, which is the most common corticosteroid or anti-inflammatory drug that's used. You can also block cytokine action, which will cut down on the production and the activity of T and B cells. And you can also block co-stimulatory molecules like interleukin-2. Current research is going into activating regulatory T cells. So at the end of the last chapter, there was a summary of types of immune cells, and there's one that I should have gone over, and that's suppressor T cells, which actually dampen down the activity of the immune system when it no longer is needed to function. So you can activate these regulatory T cells, you can induce self-tolerance using vaccines, and you can direct antibodies against these lines of self-reactive immune cells. So what happens in a failure of self-tolerance? So this autoimmunity may be caused by weakly self-reactive lymphocytes that get activated by one thing could be foreign antigens that resemble self-antigens, and this means that the antibodies that get produced against this foreign antigen can also react with the self-antigen. You can also see the appearance of new self-antigens that get generated by gene mutations, hapten attachment to proteins, infectious damage, or the release of novel self-antigens by a trauma to some sort of barrier. And probably the most classic example of this would be the testis blood barrier, which keeps sperm from contacting blood. So because the thymus and T cells reach their activation before the production of sperm cells, it means that the unique genetic codes of the produced sperm cells can be reacted against by the immune system. Hypersensitivities are immune responses to antigens that shouldn't cause any harm, perceived threats that cause tissue damage. And so these different types of hypersensitivities get distinguished by how long they last and whether antibodies or T cells are involved. So antibodies are going to cause immediate and subacute hypersensitivities, while T cells will cause a delayed hypersensitivity. So immediate hypersensitivity is also called type 1 allergies. These begin seconds after contact with the allergen or the antigen that causes the allergic reaction. And so the initial contact with the allergen is asymptomatic but sensitizes the person. So an activated IgE, which you'll see in green on this diagram, will bind to mast cells, which is the large blue cell, and basophils. And so if you have a second encounter with that same allergen, you have a flood of histamine release from these IgEs, and this results in an inflammatory response. And so this is where you get edema and swelling and hives. So here's a picture of hives and of swelling. So histamines are going to cause vasodilation, leakiness of capillaries. This is where you can get a runny nose, hives, watery eyes. If the allergen is inhaled, it can cause asthma, and you're going to need antihistamines for control of this. So allergic reactions can be either local or systemic. I want you to think about poison ivy being a localized allergic reaction, or it can be systemic. And so a local reaction is going to involve mast cells, either of the skin or, depending on the contact, respiratory or gastrointestinal mucosa. A systemic response with immediate hypersensitivity is anaphylactic shock, and you usually see this with some sort of allergen that makes direct contact with the bloodstream, an injected allergen like a bee sting. And what happens here is the bronchioles constrict, which makes breathing difficult. Additionally, vasodilation results in a low blood volume because blood is escaping from the circulatory system into interstitial space. This can cause a fatal lowering of blood pressure with circulatory collapse. And What's your treatment here? Epinephrine, and this is a picture of an EpiPen. Um, the mechanism of an acute allergic response goes as follows. So in the first step, the allergen invades the body. In the second step, plasma cells produce mass amounts of class IgE antibodies against this allergen. In the third step, these antibodies attach to mast cells in body tissues and also to circulating basophils. And what happens after this is that this causes sensitization. And in a secondary response, when you have a second exposure to that same antigen, the antigen is going to combine with the IgE antibodies that are already attached to mast cells and basophils, and you're going to get a massive histamine release. So this histamine release comes from mast cell granules, which release their content after the antigen binds to the IgE antibodies. So the histamine is going to cause blood vessels to dilate, become leaky. This promotes edema. It causes secretion of large amounts of mucus. It causes the contraction of smooth muscle. And so these are definitely conditions that set up for asthma or a potentially fatal bronchoconstriction. Subacute hypersensitivities are caused by IgM and IgG that gets transferred via blood plasma or serum. And so this is a slow onset, but it is long duration of 10 to 15 hours. And basically what happens here is antibodies will bind to antigens on specific body cells. This will stimulate both the phagocytosis and the lysis of those cellular antigens, and this can happen in a mismatched blood transfusion reaction. In a type 3 hypersensitivity, in an immune complex hypersensitivity, the antigens are not localized. They get widely distributed in the body or the blood, and you have antigen-antibody complexes that form that are insoluble, so they're going to stay in the bloodstream. They can't be cleared from a particular area of the body, and when this happens, you'll get an intense inflammation, you'll get localized cell lysis and cell killing by neutrophils. And so an example of this is systemic lupus erythematosus. Delayed hypersensitivities, or type 4, have a slow onset, and their mechanism depends on helper T cells. And in this, you've got T cells, cytotoxic T cells and macrophages that have been activated by cytokines that are causing the damage. And an example of this can be allergic contact dermatitis, and poison ivy is a great example of this. So the agents here act as haptens, and actually a tuberculosis skin test depends on this particular reaction. So as far as the formation of the immune system goes, immune system stem cells develop in the liver and spleen in weeks 1 through 9. The bone marrow becomes the primary source of stem cells later, and then through adult life of stem cells for immune cells. This lymphocyte development continues in the bone marrow and in the thymus, and type 2 helper T cells predominate in the newborn, and type 1 helper T cells predominate in the system that gets educated as a person encounters antigens. So what are some things that can cause influences on immune system function? The nervous system can actually influence immune system function. Depression, emotional stress, and grief can impair the immune response. Part of this is the production of cortisol, which is an anti-inflammatory. But you can also see dietary influences on immune system function, because vitamin D is required for the activation of CD8 cells, which are the cytotoxic T cells. With age, the immune system begins to lose its effectiveness, and when that happens, you have a greater susceptibility to both ends of the spectrum, both to immunodeficiency and to autoimmune diseases. Coincidental with this, or I should say accompanying this, is a greater incidence of cancer, because the immune system loses the ability to distinguish cancer cells from normal cells. So this is the reason why cancer increases as individuals get older. So why the immune system fails is unknown, but the thymus does atrophy starting at about the end of puberty, and this may have something to do with it. And there also may be a decreased production of both naive T and B cells.